designs and not lose the incredible volunteerism ethic within the recovery community as part of that process.
Thank you. Don and Bill, of course, you can chime in on this. What are the most important lessons the larger recovery advocacy movement can draw from the Wellbriety movement?
There's a teaching that comes from our community that talks about how the human being develops in 4 directions. In the east is emotional, in the south is mental, in the west is physical, and in the north is spiritual. And the way that I see things have unfolded as we work this recovery movement, you have evidence-based or science-based, and they do a lot of research, etc. And it seems to me they measure emotional, mental, physical science, but they don't, from what I can tell, look at the spiritual. Then when they look at scientific proof, they say, well, when this happens, it's you hardwire. This is not reversible because the way the studies show in the brain is this is the way it's going to be forever. But in our movement, a lot of things we do is involved in the spiritual. And I remember the elders told me one time, they said, when the Creator made creation, 95% of creation is in the spiritual world. In the world you cannot see. All of this is just 5%. Now we think that this is everything, and maybe the spiritual world is the 5%, but that's not what the old people say. Because I believe them because they had ceremonies, they would go there. They knew how to go into that through ceremonies and sweat lodges, and they had their way of going there, and come back different, I guess. Some cultures say, well, they went into the mountain and they come back with instructions. And, well, we have ways of going in there to get the information also. So I would say that if our spirituality, I guess it would be interchanged with our word culture. And where did that come from? Well, when our people started to live on the earth, then they become good observers. They noticed there was a world you could see, but they would see cycles, they would see seasons, and they watched the animals and movements, and they saw that there was an intelligence system that you could not see that was running everything, both of those worlds. And so when we submit grants, for example, for the most part, when we will put in there anything around ceremonies or involving spiritual, they change it into a hypothesis or a theory, and then we have to prove it. And we've been using that stuff for thousands of years, but that's the rule, that's the world we live in. So then we go do what we want, we just lie to them and we just tell them, the numbers to make it work. I guess that's how we can do it. But the spiritual, it has a power to do so many things, to correct things that you think cannot be correctable. A lot of you are living because you touched the spiritual world, and it's so, to me, it's so powerful. Even like the 12 steps, that leads you right to the spiritual world. That's what it does. It starts in the physical world, and you go mess with it, and then pretty soon it takes you to the other world. So I would say how I look at our culture is our culture was evolved by observing nature. And one of the things they observed is nature is designed is based on fulfilling needs. So the apple tree, it needs water, it needs the air, so it's always fulfilling one another's needs. But then once the apple tree gets the apples, he says, anybody can have these apples. So it's a giving system. So we learn 2 things. One is about needs, and the other to become giving. So our culture is a very giving culture. That's how I see it. And I think that's what our recovery program is, a very giving. You're giving people who can feel it in this room. You know, so I would say the greatest gift that we learned from the Walbrighty movement would be to add spirituality to everything that we do. And I would say without that, we could not. We have thousands now are as a result of adding their spirituality to the word very openly. Of course, our culture never separated church and state. Never did that, but there are certain rules, you know, that apply to something. So I would say the greatest would be the spirituality.
Yeah, I would add to that. The recovery advocacy movement, the contemporary movement, is the first recovery advocacy movement in history where people of color were present at the very beginning of that movement, which exerted an enormous impact on what's unfolded out of that movement. And I think Don and the Walbrighty movement in particular added two things to this advocacy movement that's never been there before. And that's time, a sense of time, and a sense of space. And by time, what I mean was things like the introduction of the concept of historical trauma and the role of historical trauma in addiction and recovery has enormous implications for our collective work together. And the idea of the future, that as we advocate that every decision we make should be done with the consciousness of the potential effects of that decision for 7 generations forward. I mean, think about how deep that is. I get lost sometimes in Don and I's conversations, just like walking down, I'm bumping into walls and stuff, you know, just trying to think through the implications. But that time sense has never existed before within any recovery advocacy movements in terms of the rootedness to the past and the role of trauma within that history. And not only trauma to particular groups of people, but also the trauma related to addicted people and the trauma they've experienced and the trauma recovering people experience based on stigma and discrimination. The space issue is that all the other recovery advocacy movements historically focused on the individual. And in some ways, like clinical models of treatment, we're going to reach out and change the individual. What the Walbrighty movement brought was the concept of the healing for us. This is the first time where Don began to say, you know, whole communities have been wounded by alcohol and drug problems to such an extent that maybe the whole community needs a healing process. There was no other place in the recovery advocacy movement where that came from. And early on, Don in particular directed our attention towards, we also have to heal the environment. And to bring that really right up to the present is the idea that not only whole communities but whole cultures can be wounded. If you think of the enormous divisions that are ripping our culture apart, Don and I have shared, where's the only place where people across those divisions can get together and share experience, strength, and hope? And guess where it's at? You know, it's in the rooms, it's in the recovery community. So the issue is if not only do we need to heal local communities, but if we can heal within our community and bring a message of hope to the larger community, maybe we can be a beacon to heal some of those larger divisions tearing into the world right
Did you see the blue powder come out of my head? Wait, okay, what are we doing? Thank you, Bill. So this question is for you. We sometimes get pushback when we speak of the recovery revolution you have written about. What is the evidence that this revolution is something of historical import and not just another passing fad?
Yeah, we'll both talk about it. I can remember when Don and I, I'm thinking back to 2001 in the early recovery summit that really was the kind of kinetic jumping off point of the recovery advocacy movement. When we started talking about something fundamental is happening here, and it's all going to be around this the concept and the experience of recovery. People said, that's bullshit. We've been recovery oriented for years. This is the flavor of the month. you know, when we started talking about recovery management, recovery-oriented systems of care, people said, same old, next week it'll be something different. Well, part of what we're saying, and you'll get that, right? I mean, you're gonna have to defend that this is something fundamentally different than treatment as usual or community planning as usual, etc. So here would be at least parts of my list of what's fundamentally new historically. I would begin with the explosive growth internationally of recovery mutual aid societies. And most importantly, the philosophical diversification of those recovery mutual aid societies. I think everything that's flowed since then has been birthed out of that growing diversity. The growing secular wing of Alcoholics Anonymous, the growing secular recovery mutual aid societies, the growing faith-based recovery mutual aid societies, and the enormous diversity within those. Second would be the explosive growth of virtual recovery communities. It's unprecedented and will exert profound influence on the history of everything we're involved in. I could spend days on this, but let me just make one comment. We will be reaching a day in the not too distant future in which there will be more people every day participating in online recovery support activities than will be participating in face-to-face recovery meetings. And we need to be, one, scared a bit of that brave new world in terms of what could be lost. But we also need to find ways to embrace that brave new world and bring recovery through these new media to people who've never been reached in face-to-face contact before. Mm-hmm. And in countries where those resources don't exist right now, but can get there via the internet. Third is we do have this vibrant recovery advocacy movement in the United States that continues to grow, and most importantly, dramatically spreads to other countries. If you follow my website blogs about it, once a month I try to highlight a recovery advocacy march in the Philippines, of all places in the world right now, right? In Africa, in South America, all over Europe and Canada. So what we started here in the late 1990s and early 2000s has just, I think it's going to profoundly reshape public understanding of addiction recovery, policy, issues related to addiction treatment and recovery. I think it'll radically alter the design of addiction treatment in the future, as it's starting to do right now. We have brand new recovery support institutions that are historically without precedent. We've had treatment, we've had recovery mutual aid, right? For 200 plus years. There's no precedent for recovery residences, recovery school, high schools, and collegiate recovery communities, recovery ministries, recovery industries, recovery cafes, recovery adventure programs, and on and on and on, as this conference illustrates. What we're doing is moving out of the world of closed basement rooms where people meet in secret and where people are locked up inside institutional clinical settings, and we're beginning to actually move into the life of communities and build the recovery space and landscapes and institutions. What we're seeing right now parallels other social movements like the LGBTQ movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, where we're building community infrastructures where historically marginalized people can come together and build a full life in the community. Unprecedented. We're seeing a demand that addiction treatment move from an emergency room model of brief intervention to a model of sustained recovery management nested within larger recovery-oriented systems of care. That's when treatment people say we're already recovery-oriented until they look at the details. And then they blanch. They literally experience blood loss in terms of the radical implications of what that shift will mean in terms of the design of their services. There are several other things we could add to the list, but let me just add, from us as the recovery nerd that I am, this explosive growth of recovery research. We've had this large experiential body of knowledge on recovery from our collective stories. But we could fill whole libraries with what we know about addiction, whole libraries what we know about this thing we call treatment. But historically, what do we know about recovery from the standpoint of science? Because we haven't studied it. It simply hasn't been on the drawing board. but it is now. And you know, part of it is, I want to do a sing out to the collegiate recovery programs. We have more and more people in recovery going back to school. We have more and more people in recovery going to advanced education and master's programs and doctoral programs. I'm serving on like 3 or 4 doctoral committees at the moment with people in recovery who are doing their dissertations on some aspect of recovery research. So we're beginning to really plot the prevalence and pathways and styles and processes of long-term personal and family recovery. And that scientific foundation is going to have enormous implications for our future. So, like, to summarize, right, this is not business as usual. This is not flavor of the month, okay? This is a fundamental shift in the conceptual organizing center of the alcohol and drug problems field, and a concept that could radically transform drug policy and transform addiction treatment in the United States and beyond.
No, it is spreading, you know, it's sort of like, it's like work being done in a web. It's here, and then it goes out there, and it starts to spread. And I'm so glad our native communities are including in that, because that network, it can work. I guess the question is, how much work could a network work if the network wouldn't work? A lot. And even CCAR's work, they were kind to allow me to send some native people back to the recovery coach training. At the time, I'll just say, we were lean on funding, and they allowed us to send them anyway. And came back, and the whole recovery coach process took off in Indian country because you know, of a gift, you know, that went back there. And it's spreading. You know, that web is spreading all over, and I think it's changing consciousness. It's on improvement. It's on sharing, and I think the internet has some advantages. We just joined last year. There was people here from in these rooms. Yeah. So anyway, we started a well-guided group there. You know, with them, and we're starting another one. And I mean, we're reaching one meeting online, and you can actually see them on the TV camera, etc. We have Indians in northern Canada, Yukon, and up in Alaska, and out in Ontario, and down in the Navajos, all in one space, meeting, talking about recovery. And that's really but I just think that I always love Bill talking about, it's that God gave him insight to see what's going on in this recovery movement, and then able to share it, and then we can pick the parts of that you know, fit us. And so I'm just always grateful that last time we sat here and we just 2 old guys just getting it on. You know, it's really nice. You guys just fill out one seat twice. I was snooping in there or something. No, he had some planning stuff for us to do. So thank you.
So, here's a question from the group, and it kind of ties into one of the other questions we had. So this is a surprise question for you guys, but I think it's relevant. There is so much divisiveness in the recovery community, especially amongst advocacy organizations. What do you make of this? What can we do about it? And why is this happening?
I'll start, Don, and you can jump in. To me, it's totally normal. Totally normal and totally predicted. We said, if we are to become a true social movement, there is no social movement in history that hasn't experienced fragmentation and ideological schisms as part of its growth. Think of the civil rights movement. Think of how many civil rights organizations spawned up between 1955 and 1970. All with sort of different agendas, fighting, competing for resources, fighting for ideological supremacy. We say nothing of egos, right? As that stuff unfolds. Now, what we bring that's unique is we bring some characterological chemistry that's even worse than folks from some of those other movements, agreed, given our backgrounds? So you got to factor in some of our character defects into the dynamics of these movements as well. So, I mean, it's totally expected. I don't have any problems with that. I think it's absolutely normal. The question is, can we find ways to begin to rise above those normal splits? And can we recenter ourselves to common values as we move forward? And I think the very same things that we'll find as core values drawn from the history of recovery that will center us and let us rise above those tensions, to create coalitions that allow us to bring leading organizations together to speak with one voice for recovery. And that's still in process, right? We ain't there yet. We got a bunch of the organizations going. We just haven't got to the one voice, but we're getting a little closer. So what would those values be? And in the current cultural climate, these are very rare values and precious values indeed. Things like honesty, go figure. Humility, go figure. Gratitude, forgiveness, mutual respect. We could go on with the list. You know what I'm talking about. The historical values, if we ask 100 people in recovery, what are the historical values of our community, and we merge that list. That's what will help guide us. Now, ironically, I think those are the same core values that the larger society is in desperate need of right now. I was recently reading a book by Van Jones, and he said there was this comment he made about sometimes in cultures that are under enormous pressure and chaos, you have to go to the extremes of the culture's experience to find a moral center. Well, believe it or not, in some ways, I think the recovery community is that moral center at present. I mean, I think as the larger cultures spending half their time wanting to kill each other and plant bombs in each other's mailboxes, I think the core values of this community is one thing that can help bring the whole culture back together, but it's also going to help bring the movement back together. Normal process, developmental, don't lose sleep over it. We'll get beyond it. Will we have some leaders in their ego self-destruct? That's not new in the history of recovery, agreed? Yes, that's going to happen. We have some organizations rise and fall and get caught up and get diverted into all kinds of other things. Absolutely. Normal part of the process. But like recovery, can we get up when we fall and keep on going and keep our eyes on the prize? That's what it's about. We'll do fine.
I always remember when we take certain conflicted issues to our elders, they always tell us there is a higher level of things going on. There's a guidance system that's going on, and they refer to it as natural law. And they say the natural law is always interested in harmony and balance. That's its job. It's always monitoring things to have it be in balance or harmony. And when it goes out of harmony, then it says, whoops, it's time to correct it. And so how we experience that is, they say, conflict precedes clarity. In order for anything to grow or change, you must struggle to do so first. And so there's a natural struggle that goes on, and then we human beings are at a lower level trying to figure out what's his fault, it's them, it's the white people, it's the blue people and stuff. All that time that's going on, but there's an adjustment thing going on. And I think that when things like alcoholism started to take so many of our lives and destroying families, I think the natural laws was whoops. And then when it starts the correction, there's people trying to name it. Some will call it a revolution is going on, and it's a movement. They know something is going on, and they try to give it a name, to make it happen. And so I think that all these things, just like Bill said, it's just write it out. Because I've always noticed this: when that goes on, it's like there's a spiritual selection of the people who will lead it. When a conflict occurs, there's certain people who will rise up and say, it's going to happen. And these days, what I have noticed in our tribes, and what I think is one of the corrective things that this is going to take place is going to be among the women. I think the women are going to come forth and lead, and I think they're going to play a very significant role in making sure the balance in this recovery movement continues to balance according to the natural law. So it's unfortunate we give you another job to do, but that's the way it is. So.
Yeah, and I would add one other point, Don, and that's that I think for the first time we're going to see divisions among fights over resources and money between organizations and fights over status and position among leaders and that traditional stuff. But I think what's different this time around, in the history of recovery, this is the first time people in recovery see themselves as a people, quote unquote. Not AA members, not NA members, WFS members, not Red Road members, and on, but a larger global consciousness that's kind of emerging out of our history. A very unique time, and we're beginning to build an ecumenical culture of recovery around that transcends the historical divisions within the recovery community. And for me, I think that's a sign of kind of that swarming you and I were talking about. There's something moving forward we can't even hardly name right now, but we can feel it. We can kind of feel it out there, and it's coming, and we feel like it's a healthy correction that's going to be going on.
And I think one of the things that's moving towards, and maybe this is why the female is getting more involved in this, is when you're a little guy like me and you've been around doing this stuff, you have a change in what's significant to you. One of the things for me is sustainability. Is that this thing gets going, and there's some of you young ones, you're going to have to carry the torch. And you're going to say, I'm not ready. Well, go have a cup of coffee, give yourself an hour of self-pity, 3 hours blaming somebody, and then pull up your big girl pants and get going. I believe that sustainability is going to be in the family. The sustainability is not the individual alcoholic or recovery person, because we get involved, people buy a car or some stuff like that. That's what it seems to me. But I think we've got to head towards the family. You know, I have 9 children, and I have 21 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. All my children are sober, all my grandbabies are sober, and my great-grandbaby is sober. And that's thanks to Al-Anon and Valentine and the culture and elders and sweat lodges and ceremonies and talking circles and all of that. But my family is in a sustainable mode now. And I think that's why we got to have this thing also move to include the family. That's where the mom, you get the mom, you're going to get the kids. If you get the mom and the kids, then she'll tell the old man, go to treatment or get out. You got 30 days, make up your mind, one way or the other, or whatever. But she will make it go, and I think it's.
Yeah, I think part of the correction is the women and children who were historically marginalized within the recovery community. Part of the correction is, I think the leadership of healing is going to come from them. From the women leaders in particular, and also the young people. If we think that some of us were blessed to get in recovery very young, which has really contributed to so much of what we've been able to contribute. But imagine now, we got whole generations coming into recovery at 18 to 21. When I was coming into recovery, a young people's meeting was somebody under 40. You know? And I was running around when people said, man, I spilled more booze on my tie than you ever drank. And I left more dope in my cotton than you ever shot. You know, that kind of nonsense. So I think the correction is on the way, and I think women and young people are going to be a key part of our future.
Cool. So I have a question that just came out of the conversation. Don, very early on, you talked about one of the ways you know that the recovery movement was being effective was that correct me if I'm wrong, but you talk about your children would sing your native songs, right, in the community. What are some other outcomes that you have seen that indicates we're making progress, or other outcomes that you would like to see that, yes, we have come a long way, besides the traditional scientific ones? And that's a question for both of you.
I remember some years ago, we held a conference in Denver, and we had a youth track. They would go off with some adults, and they would do a youth thing for the whole conference. Then at the end, they would have a panel come back where these youth would tell what they learned in front of the big audience. So they brought out these 4 kids, and they had a moderator, and they asked them what they learned in youth track. And one of the 9-year-olds, he was just so excited. He said, I learned to set goals, and he said, I'm going to go to high school, and I'm going to be the #1 basketball player. When I get to high school, I'm going to practice. And he said, then when I get out of high school, he said, I'm going to go to the AA, and then I'm going to go to the treatment. And he said, you know, then I'll go to travel college, and I'm going to come back and help the people. And we just all cracked up and laughed, almost simultaneously. Everybody quit laughing. Yeah. We just heard what went on. That 9-year-old thought that was the path, you know, that he had to go. And now, the difference between now and then, we have communities now. They make little paper ornaments with something symbolic to their tribe around Christmas, and they want to put on one side your name, and on the other side how long you're sober. And they want to make like a Christmas tree in the center of the community center. And what they do is they start with 3rd grade. So the 3rd graders, they go there and they say, okay, how many of you guys are sober? Raise your hands. And they fill out their little card. I'm sober at this age. This is my name. How long I'm sober. 4th grade, 5th grade. They go all the way up. And what they are doing is finding out that talk of sobriety can happen very, very young. We would never have done that years ago. You know, from where this kid is thinking that AA was a normal process, and now you're starting to see a consciousness change among the groups there. And we're seeing now tribal leaders, they are running on a platform of sobriety and winning. Never used to be that way, but there's things like that have changed tremendously. So the kids are talking differently, you know, than they were before, because we're just, it's just spreading of this whole thing we're talking about. Is people are getting these bright ideas, and who would ever think of going to 3rd graders and starting recovery movement talk, you know, with them. But that's how I see it so far.
Yeah, one thing I would add is I listened on to was I thought of, in terms of my history in the field, I remember thinking, kind of an awareness at one point. I probably worked in the field 20 years or so, and I sort of saw with greater clarity that the whole field was divided into silos. And the people only talked inside their silo. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to be a bridge person, you know, to create kind of connecting tissue? And when I started trying to do some of that, it's like, why are you talking to them people? You know, it's like, oh, I became suspect, like I've gotten contaminated. So if you ask me sort of like, what's the evidence that things have really begun to shift? One of the things is I think the silos are breaking down within the field, and I think that creates enormous tremors. You know, I mean, it's the same way that the silos in the larger culture are breaking down, with all the cultural changes that are going on, and the backlash we're seeing in response to that is much of what we see, I think, going on in the field. I'll give you one kind of a macro example of that. In the field, we've historically had prevention, we've had harm reductions, we've had treatment and recovery as an example, have been 4 major silos, right? and then silos within each of those. Agreed? So the interesting thing we're seeing now is we're seeing the breakdown of those 4 categories. There's more content, 50 years of perspective, that's all I got, is there's more contact right now between prevention and harm reduction and treatment and recovery than at any time of my 50-year time in the field. And I believe that's that synergy, that recognition that we're dealing with spectrum disorders of widely varying degrees of severity, complexity, and chronicity. We're dealing with people with radically different levels of recovery assets, agreed? From some that have enormous assets to some that have no assets, right? And that as we may be able to combine these arenas in unique ways and sequence them in ways to get recovery outcomes greater than we ever could before within a single silo. So I'm tremendously optimistic about this idea of unique combinations and sequences, and when we create a synergy between those silos, we may be generating new ideas and new approaches that were unthinkable in our past. And that really excites me.
And this is kind of a follow-up question for Don, obviously for both of you, but it follows what you were just talking about, Bill. Don, you have written a great deal about the need for a healing forest. How do we help create such a forest to heal the whole country and world, considering all the present divisive polarizations? Just a little question.
Well, I was disturbed last few years about what is all going on, because it seemed what we were doing was going to get undone. There were forces that we did not see before were showing up, and was very concerned about how can we keep going that way for another 3 years or 4 years. And I went and I spoke to the elders about this, and this is what they told me is, they said the natural law is out of balance, and now it's going to correct for the mistake. And they said one of the things needs to happen is the secrets need to be told. So the spiritual design of a secret, every secret is the spiritual side of it is designed to tell on itself. A secret cannot maintain a secret, but it will whisper the secret out. So back there in the East, there's a lot of secrets. And just repeating what they said if that Hillary got in there, the secrets wouldn't have been told. But the one that's in there now, the secrets are being told. And we're all getting, not all, but there's a lot of upset going on. 2 years ago, we had our yearly talk, and through that talk came a teaching that I'll just share with you that we got from my brother here. And in the East is a teaching called recognition. Recognition means all of a sudden you go, wow, what's going on here? Now, our elders, how they would explain it, how it explained to me, is they said our spirits was asleep. All this stuff was going on and we're sleeping. They said, now we woke up and going, wow, look what's going on here. Then the second, when enough people wake up, then what's going to happen is a resistance forms. And so they say it will spread a resistance and take on many different shapes. And the way they explained that to me is they said, we're going to see a new spiritual thing going on, and they call it swarming. And what they said is, watch nature will always tell you what you need to know. And so there's certain birds, when a hawk comes, these birds, thousands of them, they form a swarm. There's no leader, and they fly, and they turn, and they move in each shape, and they just go all different ways. And nobody's in charge, they just do it. There's certain fish, when the whale comes along, these swarms of fish get together and they just scare the enemy away. And so they said, this is the resistance. They said, pay attention to it. So they said the day after inauguration, thousands of women around the whole globe. Who organized that swarm? Just thousands of them. All different cities, all different cultures, different languages, they swarmed. When they did the immigration thing at the airports, all the airports, people just swarmed there. These young kids that did the Park Hill School. All of that swarming, and out of that swarming is where the activists come. The activists don't cause the swarming, it's the opposite. The swarming causes the activists. And so I got a comfort to pay attention and not let my fear take off and run. All those things are going back there because when I trust that elders are doing this now. In the prophecies, one of the prophecies says that a spider would build a web around the whole earth. And when it was done, they said a woman would come forth, she'd speak on that web, and all nations would hear her voice. That's what they told. 400 years they told that story down one generation after the next. And so to me, it says that we're in this conflict time of correction. It may not look like it, but I've never seen the reaction go like it does. And I expect that will be a filter down into this recovery movement too. I think if somebody messes with us, too bad, we'll swarm. Because we have a taste of what recovery is. And we have a taste of what it is to help somebody else and how to watch that other person, recover. So I don't know the answer to that. I'm only going by what the elders say. This is what's going on, and I believe that. It's a new kind of a spiritual thing, the swarming. But I would guess this is just get you all upset. I hate to deal with the swarm that you guys are doing. Somebody mess with you, because you're very in tune and you're very lovable people. Lovable do the deal, as far as I can see.
Yeah, I would add, I can recall when I first started consulting with organizations, mostly treatment organizations in those years. One of my elders, I asked, what's the most important thing I can do? I feel pretty, I'm not trained, but I'm getting all these requests to go in and help these organizations. And this person, I'll never forget what they said, the first thing you got to do is you got to go in and be silent and sense what's missing from the system. And whatever's missing, you have to find a way to bring that experientially into the life of the system. And I thought, what the hell is he talking about? He said, if you go in, he said, some systems get depressed, right? They got no energy, they got flat affect, it's like clinical depression at an organizational level. So he said, when you go into that, what do they need? They need energy, they need action. So you got to go in and be extremely active. He said, you're going to go into other places that are going to be what? They're going to be manic as hell. What do they need? You need to bring the balance and the tranquility. So you get the flavor, kind of the theme of what I'm talking about. So the question gets to be, at a cultural level, if we as a recovery community are going to exert a larger healing force on our communities and on the culture, the question we would ask is, what's missing? What are the missing ingredients that we simply aren't seeing right now? And I would encourage each of you to reflect on that question and answer it. One of the answers that I would give right now is that nobody's listening. Everybody's speaking right now and speaking in tongues in some ways, and nobody's listening. So if that's missing in the system, what do we do? I mean, what we bring to our communities is a ministry of presence in which we bring our silence and our willingness to be with people from incredibly diverse backgrounds and actually listen to them without, in a term we're used to, no crosstalk. Okay? I mean, The rooms may be the only place where there's no crosstalk in the United States right now. Agree? So, and I'm saying that's a unique attribute we have. We have the experience of what no crosstalk looks like. So maybe we can bring that as one dimension to our larger communities right now. And I think we need to model some of those values we talked about earlier. I mean, to demonstrate those quietly and in action. And we may do that not with speeches, but we may do that with our behavior collectively, modeling some of those traits of humility and graciousness and gratitude, right? And service, and on and on.
We have time for one, maybe two more questions, so pick them good. Let's do this one. What trends most excite you about current developments in the recovery advocacy and recovery support? What are the things that are exciting you right now that you're seeing? You touched on some of them, but Matt, go. Yeah.
For me, it would be the changing of the name of where we currently are. I know, like, there's an organization called NANACOA, the National Association for Children of Alcoholics. They've changed their name to now Children of Addiction, which now matches more what really is going on, you know. I remember when I came in, you know, you're coached by your sponsor, and only alcoholics work with alcoholics, and the men don't work with them, and they had all these rules. But if that were true today, I'd be working with nobody. I don't know anyone's just an alcoholic anymore. You know, there are multiple things going on with them. That's what was going on there. But to me, the top of the excitement that I see that addresses that is the recovery coaches. I just watched in Colorado Springs, Kathy Plush is here, but she started a group in the Springs called Recovery Connections. And it is an AA thing, it's not NA, it's not Al-Anon, but it's all of them. And it's connecting to the court system, it's connecting to the hospitals, it's connecting to the mental health. It's like this web is reaching out, and kids are coming in feeling safe. They don't want to go to AA like my home group, Kenya to Change, but they have an introduction that says, you know, when you come here, you talk about your alcohol problems, you don't talk about nothing else. It's about alcohol, if you got that problem, go somewhere else. But most of the people that come in here that are new, that's not the deal, you know, that they are. And sometimes there's recovery connections. They can come here and talk about whatever they want, whatever they happen to them in that period of time. They feel very safe to say, because I would say, what would happen if you went out one night and just got drunk as hell, you smoked some dope, you gambled, you checked away, you got laid? There'd be 4 meetings that you'd have to go to the and that's, before midnight. So why can't you just say, this is what happened, 8 o'clock, you're out in the bar, and you're just drinking, you're doing, you know, the deal. And I think that's what's changed. So, to me, this recovery coaching is to me a phenomenal shift in reaching out and helping people. Hospitals are asking for it. They don't know what to do. Some of our hospitals in Colorado Springs, you know, they're actually saying, would you send the coaches here? Would you show us how to do this? Would you teach us the language? I think to me that's the most significant thing. Even in our Indian country, it's different than a sponsor. It's much more effective to me in terms of working with the communities that we work with.
Yeah, I couldn't think about this question, Phil, without kind of reflecting back. I'm thinking to honor our generation, Don, when we met together, some 130-some people in St. Paul in 2001 to kind of launch this recovery advocacy movement. The excitement we had then were some really simple ideas. Recovery is a reality, and we're living proof of that. And the idea that we need a vanguard of people in recovery willing to put a face and voice on recovery and step forward into their communities and announce their presence. Simple idea. Second was there are multiple pathways of recovery and all are cause for celebration. Right? Recovery is a voluntary experience. You can mandate treatment, but nobody's ever mandated into treatment in the history of the world. You can't mandate that. We talked about people in recovery who've been part of the problem can be part of the solution. Those were, if you want to talk about the galvanizing ideas, now to say that any of us at that meeting could have thought, you know, we're going to live long enough to see public recovery marches as far as the eyes can see. That would have been unthinkable. I mean, we were hoping if we could get 75 people, you know. I mean, we thought, man, that's a hell of a recovery march, you know? And was in those early days. And we've lived to see all that. If somebody said, you're going to see grassroots recovery community organizations spreading all across the country. We're going to get a new role called the recovery coach. We're going to put recovery coaches in emergency rooms. We're going to put recovery coaches in the criminal justice system, and the child welfare system, and the primary health care system, and in educational systems, and on and on. That would have been like, what kind of dope we've been smoking? I mean, it's like a flash forward. It would have been unthinkable. We could not have conceived that we could be here being two old guys reflecting back and actually having lived the truth of that experience, what we have. So if I jump forward to today, thinking about the excitement we had in those early heady days of the movement, I think there are some core ideas right now that are absolutely transformative that we haven't yet fully grasped the full meaning of them. I think the idea that recovery is contagious is one of the most revolutionary ideas in the history of recovery. The idea that if we take recovery out of the basement rooms and thrust it into the very heart of communities and put it on Main Street, that we will have a contagious effect, that if we saturate the people who carry recovery contagiously, which we call recovery carriers, the idea if we increase the density of visible recovery carriers in the community, we will exponentially explode the number of people in recovery in any community.
Yes.
So rather than thinking about shrinking the drug problem, think about expanding the recovery solution.
Yes. Yes.
And this really comes from the well-writing movement. I think the concept of community recovery is also something that I sort of say it, I write about it. I don't think we've begun to grasp the meaning of that. That if you think of someone who's leaving treatment this afternoon, who's been locked up for 90 days, and yeah, they got the little bug, they got the nice warm pink logo on their recovery, right? But they came out of a culture enmeshed in addiction. And they're getting ready for discharge with the recommendation that they go to meetings and get a sponsor and stay in touch and get back for a couple of our continuing care meetings. And they just got graduated, quote unquote, right? So tomorrow morning they get up there stir crazy as hell because they've been locked up for 90 days. And they got to get out of their place. Where do they go to? When they walk out of the doors, geographically, I'm talking about the ecology of recovery. Where do they physically go to? And is there recovery space inside that community? They go to recovery communities. That's what's part of what's revolutionary and what I get excited about is we're really moving out of the clinical consulting rooms, right? And the treatment settings. This is treatment and recovery without walls, okay? Where the treatment forces the community itself rather than flowing out of the expert of a trained professional necessarily. So I think we're going to be doing that community building process for years to come. I also get excited and worried at the same time because any movement like this, we're going to have to build a community infrastructure to support recovery. Now, are we going to have some pimps and hustlers in that process? Yes. Who in the name of recovery are going to rip all of us off for every penny they can get? Absolutely. And you know what? That's okay, because that's part of the process. But we as a community can begin to demand, if you draw resources from the recovery community, then you got to give resources back to the recovery community. And we will hold you accountable to that. And we will expose the pimps and predators. That's
right. Yeah.
So we don't need necessarily, the government's surveillance of recovery support institution will never be as rigorous as the surveillance we can do. And so I think we create our own standards related to what we expect of those institutions. And part of nothing about us without us is we will, if you're going to be part of us and part of this community, then we will hold you accountable to service within that community.
Yes.
So anyway, I think there's some stuff, that's the kind of cutting edge stuff I think about.
Should I just drop it? Anything else you guys like to add? Any closing remarks? We're just about at the end of time, but anything else you'd like to add?
The only thing I would add is I'm looking forward to the day where I'll be sitting somewhere probably, not around, and when all of you will have an opportunity to sit in chairs like this as you move forward. So God bless.
Thank you. Amen.
Yeah, for me to, I've always had an interest in sustainability and just like the hallway talk and at the booths and vendor booths and stuff, to hear the young people talking like how they're talking, boy, it just warms my heart beyond imagination, because you know that it's in good hands. It's ever how it evolved very solid. It has like the healing forest. It has a sustainable system. It has a root system that's based on recovery, concepts, principles, spiritual, different types. Feeding the trees. You know, the trees are getting well, and the longer-term sobriety trees, you know, and then the younger ones, they're getting it. It's not going to die. It's not going to go away. The design of it was to be in harmony with nature, and I'm just excited to be here. This is one of my favorite places to come. Here is because of the our people. Yeah, yeah. You're my tribe. I guess that's the way I would say it.
Round of applause for Bill and Don. Thank you.